The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the white police officer sat confidently on the witness stand, his uniform crisp, his voice steady. He had been here before, many times in fact, telling his side of the story, painting the picture, the way he wanted it to be seen. Today was no different. She was aggressive, he said, shaking his head as if reliving the moment. Uncooperative. I had no choice but to detain her. Across the room, the black woman sat still, her hands resting on the table in front of her. She listened without emotion, her expression unreadable, as if she had seen this scene play out too many times before. The judge nodded, taking notes, while the jury leaned in, absorbing every word the officer spoke. She resisted arrest, he continued. I feared for my safety. That was always the phrase, wasn't it? The magic words that made everything else fade away. Fear. A single word that could turn the tide of any case. The officer smirked slightly. He had done this before. He knew how it would go. The woman remained silent, not a single word in her defense. No outbursts, no shaking her head in disbelief. Just calm, calculated patience. The defense attorney finally stood, adjusting his suit as he walked toward the officer. Officer, Reynolds, he said smoothly. You're absolutely sure of your testimony today? The officer nodded. Yes, sir. I've got years on the force. I know when someone is a threat. A slow, deliberate pause. The attorney turned toward the woman, his lips pressing together before he spoke again. Did you know, he said, that the woman you arrested is one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Navy SEALs? The room fell into stunned silence. The officer blinked. The color in his face drained slightly. The murmurs in the courtroom turned into whispers, then gasps. The woman finally moved. Slowly she reached for the jacket draped over the chair beside her and pulled it on. Not just any jacket, a military jacket, one that bore the insignia of a decorated SEAL. Officer Reynolds swallowed hard, because at that moment he knew he had just lied under oath about the wrong person. The room remained silent, thick with tension. Officer Reynolds's confidence had vanished. His hands, once steady, twitched slightly on the stand. He had expected this to be another routine testimony, an easy win. But now everything had shifted. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, he realized he had no control over what would happen next. The woman in the military jacket adjusted her sleeves, her movements calm, deliberate. She had spent years mastering the art of discipline, of patience. This wasn't her first battle, just a different kind. But the battlefield was the same. A system where power was often misused, where truth was often buried beneath well-rehearsed lies. The judge cleared his throat. Counselor, proceed. The defense attorney nodded, stepping closer to the officer. Officer Reynolds, let's go back to the night of the arrest. Walk us through, in detail, what happened. The officer exhaled sharply, trying to regain his composure. Like I said, she was being aggressive. She refused to comply with my orders. The attorney nodded. And by aggressive, you mean... Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. She wouldn't answer my questions. She challenged my authority. The attorney tilted his head. Challenged your authority. Did she physically resist? Reynolds hesitated. The pause longer than it should have been. Not exactly, but you said under oath that she resisted arrest. The attorney interrupted smoothly. Now you're saying she didn't? A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The jury took notes. The judge leaned forward slightly. The woman finally spoke. May I address the court? Her voice was calm, unwavering. The judge nodded. Proceed. She stood, adjusting her posture, not to intimidate, but to establish presence. A presence built on years of service, of sacrifice. She had fought in places most people couldn't even locate on a map. She had trained some of the finest soldiers in the world. And yet, none of that mattered when she was walking down a street in civilian clothes. Just another face in a crowd. That night, she began. I was coming home from a training exercise. I stopped at a convenience store for a bottle of water. When I walked out, Officer Reynolds approached me, asked for my ID. I complied. He asked me where I was coming from. I answered. He asked me again, as if my first response wasn't good enough. She turned her gaze toward the officer. And then you asked if I had a weapon. Reynolds swallowed, shifting in his seat. I told you no. You didn't believe me. You asked me again. And then you put your hand on your holster. The murmurs grew louder. The attorney turned back to Reynolds. Officer, did you see the defendant commit a crime? Reynolds' jaw tightened. No, but I had reasonable suspicion. What was suspicious about her? She was... He stopped. He had walked into a corner and realized too late that there was no way out. The silence was deafening. The woman didn't move, didn't react. She didn't need to. The truth was already settling into the minds of everyone in that room. The attorney took a slow breath before speaking. Let me get this straight. A highly trained Navy SEAL, a decorated officer, someone who has put her life on the line for this country, was suspicious because she stopped to buy a bottle of water. Reynolds' face had gone pale. The attorney turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just about a misunderstanding. This is about perception, about how some people are seen as threats before they even say a word. The tension in the courtroom had reached its peak. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. I will not have this courtroom turn into a debate on social issues. The attorney nodded. Understood, Your Honor. But what I am doing is proving that this officer did not have a valid reason for this arrest. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew the weight of this case, the attention it would get, the scrutiny. The woman sat back down, folding her hands on the table. She had faced enemies in combat. She had trained for survival, but the hardest battles were the ones she fought at home, where the uniform she wore meant nothing the moment she took it off. The jury had heard enough. The tension was thick, and the outcome of the trial felt inevitable. But just when it seemed like the case was about to reach its turning point, Reynolds did something no one expected. He looked up at the judge and said, I'd like to change my statement. Gasps filled the courtroom. The woman raised an eyebrow, studying him. Was this guilt, or was it strategy? The next words out of his mouth would determine everything, and everyone was waiting. As the days dragged on, the chef couldn't shake the feeling that the entire town had been caught in a twisted game. Everywhere he went, people whispered about the case, the mysterious Navy SEAL woman, and the corrupt cop who had framed her. The tension in the air was thick, and every time he passed the courthouse, he could feel it. The weight of secrets waiting to be uncovered. He had become obsessed with the truth. The more he learned, the more he realized how deep the lies went, and how many people had a vested interest in keeping the truth hidden. The Navy SEAL woman, whose name he had finally learned to be Maya Davis, was no longer just a woman facing a false charge. She was the target of a much larger conspiracy, one that involved powerful people who would stop at nothing to keep her silent. The chef knew he was in over his head, but there was something about Maya's quiet strength that kept him going. He couldn't let this woman, someone who had risked her life to serve her country, be torn down by a web of lies. One evening, as the chef sat in his small kitchen, cleaning the counters, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Hesitant, he answered. On the other end of the line, Maya's voice was low, but unmistakable. "You're the one who's been asking questions," she said, almost as if she knew exactly who he was and what he'd been up to. "I need your help, and I need it fast." The chef's heart pounded in his chest. He'd always known he couldn't do this alone, but hearing her on the other end of the line made everything feel more real. It wasn't just about standing up for the truth anymore. It was about protecting a woman who had become the target of something much bigger than either of them could have anticipated. They arranged to meet at a secluded spot just outside the town, far away from prying eyes. As he arrived, the dim light of the street lamps barely illuminated the surroundings. But there she was, standing with a calm intensity that sent a chill through him. Maya had a look in her eyes that told him she knew exactly what was at stake, and she wasn't afraid. "I didn't want to drag you into this," Maya began, her voice steady, "but I can't do it alone. I've been trying to get the truth out for weeks, but every time I get close, something pulls me back. People in the military, in the government, they don't want my story getting out. They'll do anything to make sure it stays buried." Maya's eyes were fierce now, her voice unwavering. She told the chef how she had been assigned to a covert mission that had uncovered a massive corruption ring involving high-ranking officials, the same officials who had orchestrated the cops' false report to discredit her. The more she dug, the more dangerous it became. The lies had escalated, and soon, Maya had become the pawn in their twisted game. Framed for a crime she didn't commit, they'd hoped she'd stay silent, but she hadn't. She couldn't. The chef knew he had to act fast. Maya had risked everything to expose the truth, and now, with the right information, they could finally take down the corrupt officials who had tried to ruin her life. But they couldn't do it alone. They needed proof, and that proof was locked in a hidden file that only a select few had access to. It was a gamble, a dangerous move, but it was their only chance. The next few days were a whirlwind of strategy, planning, and danger. They snuck into the government building late at night, avoiding security, hacking into systems, and finally retrieving the evidence that would bring the truth to light. The chef had never imagined himself in a situation like this, but his trust in Maya and her courage kept him moving forward. As the file was downloaded onto a secure drive, the tension in the air was palpable. They had everything they needed, but now they had to escape without getting caught. Just as they were about to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. The chef's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. Without thinking, he grabbed Maya's hand, pulling her into a hidden corner, holding his breath. For what felt like an eternity, they stood there, barely breathing as the footsteps drew closer. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the coast was clear. They made it out just in time. The file was delivered to the press the next morning, and within hours, the truth spread like wildfire. The corrupt officials were exposed, the lies were unveiled, and Maya's name was cleared. The town, once filled with whispers and suspicion, was now buzzing with a renewed sense of justice. The cop who had framed her was arrested, and the truth was finally out in the open. As the dust settled and life returned to normal, the chef and Maya stood outside the courthouse, watching the crowds disperse. She looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. The chef nodded, his heart still racing from the adrenaline of the past few days. "We did it together," he replied. And just like that, the story came to an end. But the lesson remained. The chef had learned that the truth, no matter how buried, would always rise to the surface. Maya's strength, courage, and determination had shown him that even in the face of injustice, the power of one person could change everything. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, the chef couldn't help but reflect on what had just transpired. Sometimes, the greatest heroes aren't the ones we expect. And sometimes, the greatest battles aren't fought in the places we imagine. But if you have the courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost, you can change the world. And with that, the story came full circle, leaving behind a town that would never forget the bravery of one Navy SEAL woman, a determined chef, and the powerful truth that they fought so hard to uncover. To many,